I am Jenny Lin, Associate Professor of Critical Studies in USC's Roski School of Art and Design, and it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you today to the final Roski Talk of Spring 2021. Woohoo! I am joined by my esteemed colleague, curator and scholar Anu Vikram, who is going to be leading our Q&A following today's talk. I am delighted that we are about to hear from Simon Leung, an artist whose work I have been thinking and writing about ever since I encountered it many moons ago. Simon is one of those rare and brilliant artists who gracefully straddles practice and theory, often while squatting, as I think he will show us today. I and Anu and others have been extremely fortunate to experience firsthand how Simon, as an artist, thinker, and teacher, inspires so many intellectuals and artists, including many of us here in Roski. I know David Kelly and Ruben Ochoa are in the audience too, and we're all so thrilled to welcome you here today. Now I am very pleased to hand it over to our first year MA student, Francesca Flores, as well as our MFA student, Francesca Flores, and Ray Chun Tsai, our MA student, who are going to introduce Simon before his talk. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Simon. Such a great treat to have you and finish off this last talk. So just to introduce you again, so UC Irvine's art professor Simon Leung has been composing works of art through various mediums about ethics, politics, and the body by identifying the context they're used in, how they are perceived and traced. Moreover, Leung's work examines the psyche and otherness seen in projects such as The Side of the Mountain and Transcripts. In addition to their position in the art department at UCI, Leung is an active affiliate in multiple departments at UCI, such as the Department of Asian American Studies, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Center for Global Peace and Conflict Studies, and much more. So yeah, just wanted to briefly introduce you, and so you could introduce your work the best that we can. So yeah, feel free to begin.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect.
Oh, awesome. So I'm really so happy to be here. And first, I want to thank Suzanne Lacey and Jenny Lin for inviting me, and Anu for teaching the seminar and facilitating it. I feel so warmly about USC because I've spoken here many times, and I was just watching Ruben Ochoa's lecture at LACMA about his monument project, and I was just so happy to see his work and know that some of my friends like David Kelly, Patty Chang, Mary Kelly are teaching at USC. So very happy to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and we can begin. Great. So I thought I would give this talk a title called Matter and Motion, That's How It Goes. And it might become clear in a while why that is the title. But in general, I've been thinking about the performative. For 10 years, I've taught a class at UC Irvine called The Performative, and it's a very large lecture class, 160 to sometimes more, 200 students. And I talk about the performative as a way to think about all kinds of things that happens not only in performance or in dance, experimental theater, etc., but also just in the way in which we think about categories of being. So this talk is kind of structured around 5 to 7 works. We'll see if we get to the end, where I think the performative is operative. So I'm going to show, first of all, a work called Surf Vietnam. And what many of these works have in common is that I worked on them for quite a few years at a time. So Surf Vietnam, it started when I read an article in the style section of the New York Times in 1992, and it's at the time there was no diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam. It was still, I think, it was beginning to be the Clinton administration, but it was at the end of the Bush administration. And this is an article, it's kind of a throwaway article in a sense, just about how kids from Orange County in California were going to Vietnam to teach the locals to surf as a sort of a goodwill mission. And I was immediately struck by the image on the right, in that the image of the surfboard looked a little bit like a bomb to me. And the caption reads, "China Beach, where a scene in Apocalypse Now above was filmed." And so immediately I recognized this as a type of misfit, because by then it was, not by the 90s, it was quite well known that Apocalypse Now, the film, in which Francis Ford Coppola set Heart of Darkness in Vietnam, was not in fact filmed in Vietnam at all, but in the Philippines. And thus it was impossible that China Beach, where Apocalypse Now was filmed, would have taken place in Vietnam. So that began a way for me to think about what I can possibly do with this image. So I cut out the article, and you see it's this kind of in a long rectangular shape. And I had a piece of plank of wood in my apartment in New York, and I just pinned this article on the board, and suddenly it gave me a form. So Proposal for Surf Vietnam was the first manifestation of the work after I'd been working on it for a couple of years. And this was an installation in San Francisco where I made 10 prototype boards. They're fiberglass on foam. And you see, just very, very simply, I had enlarged the article and had put them in these kind of like prototype surfboard constructions. They were shown maybe 2 or 3 times, the proposal version. This was the installation in San Francisco. And I pinned up also a map of central Orange County, which coincidentally is now where I work. And also on the right, it's a very blurry slide. I had made 3 proposal configurations, and each one was based on words in the article that were in quotation. The top, this sort of triangular shape, the words "Apocalypse Now" appeared twice in the article, so that's one of the configurations. The middle one is the quote, "The Vietnamese are waiting for us to come." And the bottom, the quotation was, "The kids really enjoy getting up on the board." And these 3 quotations initiated the first 3 installations of what I thought of as a proposal to do a work in Orange County. So around this time, I was teaching at Cal Arts, and I contacted Tyler Stallings, who was the curator at the Huntington Beach Art Center at the time, and I proposed to do the piece there. This is because Huntington Beach Art Center is not only in Huntington Beach, where surfing takes place. As you know, Huntington Beach has been in the news lately as one of the centers for the battles around white supremacy. Uh, but if you were to go from the pier at Huntington Beach inland, you would basically go up Beach Boulevard, which is where the Huntington Beach Art Center is. And the US Open of Surfing, I suppose still is, but was held at the Huntington Beach piers. So in 1998, this came to a realization. So in addition to the three versions of the surfboards that are based on words in quotation, I worked with three more groups to make newer installations or different installations. So this is a version of Apocalypse Now, which was up for 2 weeks because it appeared in the article twice. The kids really, I'm sorry, this one is the Vietnamese are waiting for us to come. The kids really enjoy getting up on the board. And in addition, I worked with three groups to make other configurations of the surfboards. So this was made in collaboration with the surfing team at Huntington Beach High School. There are 19 boards in all. And I had thought a lot about numbers. So 19 was, at the time that I started the project, the number of years between the end of the Vietnam War and when the article appeared. But 19, as many of you all also know, was the average age of the American soldier during the height of the Vietnam War. And I had been thinking about how, you know, in a way, high school kids, or what, I don't know, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, they were just younger than the average age of the soldiers. And how in Huntington Beach, which was, and I suppose continues to be, a politically prototypical Orange County type of city, there were a lot of veterans. There were obviously a lot of surfers. But by that time, or at least since the mid 70s, Orange County also had a sizable Vietnamese population, and Westminster, which is just next to Huntington Beach, has the largest Vietnamese commercial community in America. So this was a collaboration with the Huntington Beach High School team. And when I was working with them, one of them said to me that, oh, you know, when somebody dies in a surfing accident, what takes place is that, you know, we would ride out to into the ocean and form a circle as a sort of memorial. So one of their ideas, which I thought was really, really great, that we enacted was that at the beginning of that week, we had 19 boards, and gradually the kids would come in throughout the week and would take boards away. So on the left is what the installation looked like at the beginning of the week, and on the right is what it looked like following by the end of the week. I also worked with the Anaheim Vet Center. This is a drawing by one of the gentlemen that I worked with, and he was thinking very much about his experience in the military, but also in terms of body bags and tombstones. So this was his rendition, and as you see, we just basically enacted it. There's camo netting at the top of the space, and I fulfilled, you know, the directions of the folks that I was working with. This was a collaboration with somebody who was in the Vietnamese community. She was very much a community leader. And she was somebody who was uh, evacuated to the United States, to Camp Pendleton in 1975 after the end of the war. And she thought that it would be appropriate for her to make a waterfall. So this is a version of the waterfall. And on the right, you see a piece of vellum paper that is covering one of the surfboards. But the word San Clemente is cut out. And San Clemente, of course, is the city that is right next to Camp Pendleton, which is the Marine base where the Vietnamese refugees were before they were resettled in the United States. So, very much a type of affective trigger, if you will, that San Clemente had for her. One of the other immigrants from Vietnam that I worked with suggested that we make a new board. And he was somebody who was a reporter, and one of his articles was on the front page of the New York Times in April 1975, right before the fall of Saigon. As you remember, by the end of the month, the war would have been over. So he was thinking very much about how this idea of the beach and how Americans relate to Vietnam as a sort of blank spot where you can name China Beach based on what you know, but there was no such thing as China Beach in Vietnam at that point. So he suggested that we make a new board, which we did, about Cam Ranh Bay, a beach that the Vietnamese used, but it became an evacuation site by early April 1975. And in addition, I made 3 videos. On the left is somebody holding up the article, Surfs Up at China Beach, and it is actually based on the idea that the GIs named China Beach in Vietnam on China Beach in San Francisco, which was in the 19th century a beach that was called China Beach because Chinese people went there. So there's a sort of back and forth circulation between the two. In the middle are images of surfers waiting for the waves, but never quite surfing. And on the right, there are 2 surfers that I worked with. This guy here is Jack, and they try to surf on the prototype boards. And there's this idea that if you're a surfer, you can surf anything, but they weren't actually successful in getting up on the board and surfing on it. So here are some of the kids that I worked with, and the US Open of Surfing had their reception at the exhibition. So just to show you ethnographically what goes on at a site such as the Huntington Beach Art Center circa 1998, you see that cohabitating with my exhibition is a bikini contest. And on the bottom is Donovan Frankenreiter's band playing. He's a surfer and a musician. Okay, so that's the first work. And I put 3 of the prototype boards in various sites in Orange County. The top is the Surf Rider Surf Shop. I put a prototype surfboard at the Anaheim Vet Center where I was working with some of the folks who collaborated with the project. And on the right is the campus of UC Irvine. And what you see there is the Southeast Asian Archive in the library at UC Irvine, which then, and perhaps even continues today, to be the largest Southeast Asian study center in the US. So I'm going to go on to talk about some of the squatting projects. Uh, I won't uh, talk about all of them, but I'll just touch on maybe 3 or 4. So 1994, Berlin. I was invited by the Kunsthaus to do a summer residency in Berlin in 1994. And I had been thinking about the squatting body for some time by then. And so I used that opportunity to, in a sense, research a project that I was going to do later in the year, also in Berlin, with NGBK, another institution which had invited me to be in an exhibition um, at the end of that year. So in a sense, this is a summer project and then a winter project. So at the Kunsthaus, I was doing some demonstrations on squatting. So this is, it's kind of a lecture performance, but it's just kind of talking about squatting with various folks in the audience, talking about the benefits of squatting, thinking about squatting in relationship to translation, how Hocken, the word for squatting in German, would have a different type of connotation than squatting in English, but how also squatting was in terms of squatting houses, the illegal occupation of real estate, was also something that was very well understood, at least at that moment in Berlin. There was a cigarette ad which I saw at bus stops called Test the West. And if you remember, 1994 was still relatively the earlier moment of reunification for Germany. So I think the idea of testing the West has multiple meanings. And I thought, yes, I am a younger version of me at least. I am testing the West here. So in the summer, I did, research like this, impromptu performances or just research documentation. And then in the winter of 1994, I made a project called Squatting Project Berlin. So I returned to a bus stop. NGBK, I don't know if it still exists. I think it might still exist, but Frank Wagner was the curator who invited me. And he had conceived of a project that was built around what translates into English as the business of violence. And it was really an exhibition that dealt with violence that was visited upon immigrant population in Germany in the early 90s. So along with reunification of Germany, a lot of other things developed, such as the forced repatriation of 50,000 out of the 60,000 Vietnamese guest workers who were contracted to work in Vietnam. So the Vietnamese who remained in Berlin by that time had a sort of gray zone status. Many of them couldn't work. They could only really survive by selling illegal cigarettes. I just realized, shades of police brutality in this country. Illegal cigarettes at bus stations or train stations. But this idea of a Vietnamese refugee brought to mind a story that my younger brother had told me when we were kids. I had grown up in Hong Kong, but when I was a teenager, I was living in Northern California. And my younger brother, about 3.5 years younger than I, said to me, oh, I saw some Vietnamese people at the bus stop today. And this must have been, I figure, around 1980 or so, because that was 1979, 1980 was when Vietnamese folks were being resettled, across the country, and many of them were uh, resettled in San Jose, California. Anyway, I asked him, well, how did you know that they were Vietnamese? And he said to me, well, they were squatting. There were chairs, there were benches at the bus stop, but they were squatting. So I had been thinking about this for a very, very long time by then, maybe even up to 15 years by then. Because to me, that statement bespoke a relationship my younger brother had with his body that I find a bit painful, in the sense that here was an assimilating child's marking the difference between himself and other Asian bodies that perhaps to the gaze of others would very much resemble his own. So squatting became, at least to his eyes, this mark of difference, this mark of the fresh off the boat, or the people who don't know how to behave in a Western metropolis. But nonetheless, it is something that is inhabited. So by the time that I made this work, I've been thinking a lot about how do you know if somebody is something? How do you know if somebody is Vietnamese? And in the 90s, when I was making this work, I began to develop a sort of operative system for myself. And that was the idea that misrecognition is my medium, in the sense that almost everything that I made at that point, I was very much relying on the interpretation of the reader and their misrecognition, or maybe in a more psychoanalytically informed sense, the ipso facto misrecognition that is identity to be a type of operative mode in which I can work. So I made 1,000 posters, and 500 of them had text around the figure, which read, imagine a city of squatters, an entire city in which everyone created their own chairs with their own bodies. When you're tired or when you need to wait, participate in this position, and observe the city again from this squatting position. So here are some images of them in situ in Pittsburgh. Several years after that, I was invited by the Generali Foundation in Vienna to make a new work. It was a pretty good gig. They invited me to be in a 4-person exhibition. It was curated by Matthias Paletner, who's now a resident of Los Angeles. The other artists were Dorrit Margreiter and Nils Norman. And each one of us was, in a sense, asked to respond to the institution. And when you read reviews or writings about this exhibition, you would find titles such as the Institution for Institutional Critique, or things along that line. And I think it had to do with how folks like Matthias and Dorrit at the time, Nils Norman and I, were associated with institutional critique in a sort of loose sense. And so this project, Squatting Project Wien, was placed into the context of an exhibition called The Making of. And the idea of the institution was, at the forefront of all of our works. So I was very interested in this idea of an institution, in a sense, demanding a type of, or requesting, but implicitly demanding by their invitation, a type of institutional critique, a type of inoculation, if you will, that the artist can inject into the body of the institution uh, to, uh, in a sense, legitimate the institution or make it stronger. So I was thinking very much about this type of work as a type of vaccination. And so uh, I was doing a bit of research and I realized that the Generali Foundation, first of all, I realized that Generali Foundation was not, in fact, a foundation because the Generali Foundation is a part of the Generali Corporation, which is one of the oldest insurance companies in Europe. And they had branches all throughout Europe. None other than Franz Kafka worked for the Prague branch of Generali Corporation. And in the city of Vienna, where the Generali Foundation was housed, there were 131 buildings owned by the Generali Corporation as real estate investment. And so I thought this is a good mode of comparison in that I can perhaps compare the art collection of Generali Foundation with the real estate holdings of the Generali Corporation. So my project then was to project images of the buildings that Generali already had taken for its real estate portfolio catalog, but I made 131 new photographs where I squatted in front of every single building owned by the Generali Corporation in the city of Vienna. And it took about 2.5 weeks to do that. I also did this, I believe, in January, and do not recommend making an outdoor piece for 2 weeks in January in Vienna for obvious reasons. Anyway, you see on the below each photograph, there's information about the building. So it tells you how big it is, where it's located, where it's occupied, etc., etc. The bus stop keeps recurring in my work, it seems. So here I, was thinking about, obviously, the institution and the institution's relationship to the artist. So in a sense, the body of the artist becomes a type of indexical trace to the foundation relative to the corporation. But at the same time, I think that one can extract from this economy of scale, perhaps a reading of the guest worker, in that I myself was a very privileged version of a guest worker in Vienna. Unlike in Berlin, I don't think they were there were a lot of Vietnamese guest workers, but certainly there were a lot of Asian classical musicians in Vienna. So as poetic justice would have it, one of the buildings that Generali Corporation owned in the city of Vienna was a sort of courtyard theater. So if you enter into the courtyard, you enter into a little standalone building that was a theater. And at the time, they were putting on Kafka's, or a stage version of Kafka's The Trial. So I thought this was a meeting of various Kafkan motifs, metamorphosis, and the trial, and maybe Kafka's own life story, working at Generali. This is a work that Jenny has written about, and I think she saw it in Guangzhou in 2008. Um, it's based on a 2-minute clip in the middle of a film called Center Stage by the Chinese, Hong Kongese filmmaker Stanley Kwan, who's rather well known for being one of the first out gay filmmakers in Hong Kong. But his uh, his oeuvre is saturated with um, the subjectivity of women as a type of central concern. And Center Stage is a film about Leung, who was the first, how should I put it? Well, I don't know if she was the first, but she was considered a sort of Greta Garbo, a great actress of the silent screen in China. And this film sort of is set around 1934, 1935, when she was transitioning to talkies along with the rest of the Chinese film industry. But she committed suicide in 1935, and her suicide was called by the New York Times, nonetheless. The funeral, her funeral was called the funeral of the century. So in the middle of this film, there was a 2-minute scene in which a director, here played by Tony Leung, is squatting in front of these urban backdrops. And Yun Leung, played by Maggie Cheung, she comes upon him and she asks him, "What are you doing?" And he looks at her and he says, "I'm squatting." She's asking him, do you like squatting?" And he says, "Well, all of China, so many people, we're all squatting. We're squatting, waiting to be humiliated, waiting at the behest, at the whims of people more powerful than us, waiting for people to slap us on the back of the head." And then she says, "Well, we also squat just to rest." When I was just starting out in the movies, I would squat just waiting for work. And he looks back at her and he asks her, "When was the last time you squatted?" And she said, "Well, not since I've been a movie star, of course." And then the scene closes after he asks her to squat with him. He literally says, "Let me see you squat." So that's the 2-minute clip. And from this 2-minute clip, what I wanted to do was to make a work which uses the images, the dialogue, and subtitles, each as a way of scoring the project. So it's not exactly to scale, but you see how I asked the Guangzhou Triennial to build a room. And so you would enter through this center stage and you would see projections on either side. And the Guangzhou Triennial, by the way, takes place in Guangzhou, China, which is a Cantonese city. And by the way, this is an impossible view because the idea is that you can only see one side or the other. So this is a trick of the camera, but you can see it that way. In any case, I very much wanted to make a work that was about Chinese self-regard, vis-a-vis squatting. And so the reason that I don't have any images of the subtitles here, but the reason that I thought about subtitles and the dialogue as variations of score is because I made a work based on these 2 minutes in center stage. And there were 9 versions, so there were 18 versions of this all in all. And I would disperse throughout these 19 different versions, variations of Cantonese dialogue, Putonghua dialogue, and English dialogue, and along with that, subtitles in traditional Chinese script, simplified Chinese script, and English. And this was, in a sense, also a meditation on this, the city of Cantonese. Canton is Guangzhou, so Cantonese exactly means the language of the people of Guangzhou. But how within an international framework, such as like biennial or triennial, we, in a sense, are always working with power dynamics, such as which language squats under which other languages, and what is the language that we use to position power and communication. This is a project called Proposal for Squatting Project Hong Kong. And as you see, I started working on it in 2010, and I'm still working on it. And you'll see why I'm still working on it. I'd come upon this image from 1967 in some readings about Hong Kong, about the history of Hong Kong. And you see here a row of squatting bodies down a stairwell, of course. You see the police. This is the Hong Kong Colonial Police. They are in riot gear. The people who are arrested, who are squatting, it can be inferred that they are part of this organization you see at the top left. The first word is cut off, but it says Kowloon Basi Funwui, which means the Kowloon Bus Company Association. So it might be some kind of union, let's say, or workers association. And the usual caption for this project, for this photo would be that these were quote unquote leftists who were arrested in 1967 in Hong Kong. Now, I needn't explain what type of city Hong Kong is to you anymore, but perhaps prior to the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, one would have had to. And so you can sort of like keep in mind that this is a project that initiated in 2010. So here are the elements, right? Here are the police. Here's an arrest. Here are leftists. Here is the idea of a people that is in Hong Kong, but in some way is associated with or has some sympathy to people in China in the form of the Cultural Revolution. The 1967 riots was very much seen traditionally as a type of spillover from the Cultural Revolution within China, which lasted from 1966 to 1976. And so for a show in Hong Kong called Spectral Evidence, curated by Stephen Lam, I made a work called Proposal for Squatting Project Hong Kong, an image, a lecture, a screening, a conversation, a workshop. And the idea was that you can take this image and you can use it however you want. And all I'm really offering is a sort of return to this image from 1967. So here you see an installation of it as a large vinyl at one of the art spaces where I was doing the project called 1H Space. And you see here, this is one way that you can use the image. On the left is my aunt, on the right is my mother in Hong Kong, and they're kind of, taking a picture with my work. But then there are other ways to think about this image, and this is the lecture version of it in another space, which is a warehouse type space called Sigma Space in another part of Hong Kong, where converted factories, as they are all over the world, are being converted into art spaces. Here is the squatting workshop with some participants. And then I was also thinking about how one can use this image not as something static, but as something that you can activate. So this work, I kept thinking about due to what has been happening in Hong Kong for all of this time. And so for the Guangzhou Biennale in 2018, I made a work that was called Rehearsal for 9 Collective Movements. And I was thinking about it as both a type of poem and a dance. That's kind of the formal qualities I was thinking about for it. And the work is built around 9 scripts or 9 things that I consider scores. So as you see here, Duchamp's New Descending a Staircase. On the bottom left here, it's Kim Jong-un meeting the South Korean president. There's our favorite K-pop boy band. On the right, you see a passage from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and these are variations of interpretations. So this is kind of a version of New Descending a Staircase. And the college students I was working with, none of them actually spoke English. It's very interesting, but there's the K-pop dancers, and this is an interpretation of Invisible Man, where it's a passage where an evicted elderly Black couple in Harlem, their possessions are strewn all over the sidewalk in this eviction. And in this moment of what Jonathan Flatley calls the mood, sort of like a Black Leninist mood, communist mood, the community decide to stop the eviction and take the possessions of the couple back into the apartment. So I won't describe these in detail, but as you see, these are continuations of interpretations. The one on the left, by the way, is M Walk, Yvonne Rayner's M Walk, and on the right is the film M. M Walk is from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and M is, of course, another Fritz Lang film. And I was very much interested in this scene in the middle of M, where a group of people, they rush up the stairwell, and then they're beaten down by the police. So this is the Rainerian section. And of course, this photograph reappears. And I, in Cantonese, was reciting the text on the right. um, which is based on what one of the protesters, who was a teenage girl at the time, what she said she was feeling and thinking about during the time of the protests in 1967. Okay, so I'm now going to, let's see how much time do I have? Okay, 2:51, so I'll talk for about 10 more minutes. Okay, so transcript, some notes between pricks. It was made in, it was first made in 1991, and I realized that when I first presented it, it was at UCLA for an art history conference. And Amelia Jones, who was in school with me, was my respondent. So I don't know if Amelia is in the audience, but uh, that just came to my mind. In any case, this was a work that I made in different contexts, in Los Angeles, at UCLA, but also at LACE and in New York for a cultural studies conference at CUNY Grad Center, at the Drawing Center, and this version, which was at the Anthology Film Archives for the 5th Gay and Lesbian Film Festival, Experimental Film Festival, which was then called Mix. So you see, what you see here is what the audience would see. This photograph was actually taken by Mi-Wan Kwan. On the left, you see me on a live broadcast. On the right, you see a pre-recorded video, and then somebody is filming me live. So this is a sort of another version of the same piece. So you see here, the artist is behind a screen, so you don't get direct visual access to the artist except as a live playing section. And then there's a pre-recorded section. And in the pre-recorded tape, you see a hand endlessly pricking a piece of paper. For a few years, maybe late 80s to early 90s, I had made these pinprick drawings, and I was making these pinprick drawings. I kept thinking about, well, all kinds of things, because they're very, very labor intensive. A couple of years after I finished, or maybe, yeah, a year after I finished doing the transcripts, performances, a version of these pinprick drawings was in the Whitney Biennial of 1993. So, you know, at the time I was working on these different projects, but each one actually was like a machine to help make the other. So I was thinking about pinpricks and the idea of pinpricks. But at the time, I was also thinking a lot about AIDS. So I'm going to read a little passage that I wrote for something which gives you a sense of those times. During the end of the 80s in New York, not a day went by when AIDS was not a preoccupation. It haunted our intellectual lives, our friendships, our politics, our most intimate liaisons. I've recounted this elsewhere, but this was how I structured my time during the year in the Whitney ISP, which for me was 1988-89. I, along with at least 4 to 5 cohorts from the program, would attend ACT-UP meetings on Monday nights and ISP seminars on Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons. In between was life in New York: art making, reading, partying, nightclubbing, friendship, and activism. If during that year in the ISP I had made a commitment to being an artist who, quote, works politically, unquote, who works with what I have described since that time as, quote, the ethical, it was because the late 80s felt like a time of perpetual mourning. it was very common to learn that someone you know, people in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, had died. People you knew who debated tactics at an active meeting or demonstrated alongside you or published an op-ed that angered you because they took a retardere position on the politics of gay life. Some of them were lovers or friends, almost exactly my age. My interest in the ethical, in the vulnerability and mortality of the other, and in Levinas in particular, indexes coming of age in this atmosphere. So this is kind of how I was, situating myself. And so the video, the pre-recorded video, had the hand pricking, it had a mouth at the glory hole. And this, by the way, was something that I made as it is a film still from something I made as an undergraduate for Paul McCarthy, who was my teacher at UCLA. So this image dates from, I don't know, 1987-ish. And as does this one. So on the one side, there was this type of image. And on the other side is a gradual disrobing and reading of some philosophical text, some sort of descriptive writings I had done. So my obsession at that time was really about thinking through the politics of mourning and the insufficiency both in activism and theory in articulating the complexity of what anonymous sex was. So on the one hand, there was a sort of moralization from the right, and then there was a moralization from within the gay community. In any case, I'm gonna jump ahead to how I dealt with the same issue, namely AIDS in the public sphere, a decade later, 10, 11 years later. And this is an opera that I made with the composer Michael Webster. It was for a solo exhibition at the Santa Monica Museum, which is now ICA LA. So this was in 2002, sorry. So I thought about an opera about anonymous sex, because between the early 90s when I made transcripts and circa 1997, 98, when protease inhibitors came on the market, the scene had changed considerably. And it was also at the beginning of, in people hooking up on the internet. So cruising in real time in the park became a type of almost activity that was nostalgic for its own present. So I had made a room at the Santa Monica Museum, which was based on, if you look at the bottom left of this floor plan, it's based on a room at the Santa Monica Museum, and I basically rotated it 90 degrees and replicated it within the main gallery of the museum. This is what it looks like inside. That was what I called a modular mountain. And there were 4 video monitors. You only see 3 in this view. So what you see, and you can't really tell from this light, but there are color lights on the outside. So what I was interested in doing was to take elements of an opera and displace it so that the set became the seating area. The live people were the audience, but not the performers. The lighting was outside of the room. On the left, bottom left, you see what happens in the opera. The monitor right next to the door is a scene of downtown Los Angeles as it transforms from day to night, so the hour of dusk. And the opera is technically the third act of a larger opera, but it's a complete opera in of itself. And it's about 25 minutes. And on the top right-hand corner, you see a view of the observatory when it was also shot at dusk. So it's the observatory, and then it becomes a type of silhouette. So this meditation between the time of the city, the time of the park, and the time of the stars, the times, in a sense of space, was quite important to me, these different orders of time and their transformation. And the opera had a very, very, very simple plot. Two men meet in the park, in Griffith Park. And Griffith Park, as you know, is on the side of the mountain, and thus the title of the opera. And I was thinking about the park as a type of mirror of the city because it looks at the city. And at the same time, it is a type of utopian impulse of the city. So this is the first aria of the opera. It's the tenor aria. So I thought it would be appropriate for me to just give you a feel of it. Eyes on me where only space has known, haptic and tethered, like a ball spin around the radius of me. All the goods to be gotten, invisible circle and half circle, a tree, another tree, a will to bear, a body to go inside. I know where I am. This is a man, folding and unfolding his mask below covering. A man is a large thing, not just his mouth, all of him, all of the man, more than you can hold, can't cover the whole man. So I thought I would just do that and give you a sense of how the piece plays out, in that I wanted to use feelings and use music and singing as a way to articulate something that comes out of you, but is larger than you. So, it's very much related to how the idea of the body of the actor or the singer is really a type of instrument of saturation, and there are many, many ideas that are held within that body. So I drove here in a car. Well, that's what you do. Matter and motion, that's how it goes. You drive yourself, you taste your will. I am here, and this is the man blowing me. This is the one for today, for tonight. Do I count or not? At what point does it begin? All bodies comparable, no two faces the same. This is the one for today, particulars, details, like the curve of a tree, semicircle bent, the length of a cock. A body between us, not mine, not his. Imaginary body, color there is no color. This is this. All points exposed, all points, a departure, the radius, what I can see. Measure this man, the texture of hair, the trunk of the body, his arm, his palms, no face, all faces infinite, a dome on the hill to look at the sky. Love moves toward a singular destination, constant. Leave it that way, always the same. If the stars change, you cannot tell. So the tenor in his aria, I think you can tell is very much using using sex as a type to gather himself, as a way of uh, marking the space in a sort of phenomenological way. I see that Anu has reappeared, so I think we should probably end here.
I'm
I'm
afraid
just
we've
gonna.
reached that time. Yes.
That's
As lovely as it is to
fine.
listen to you sing, which I think we could all just sit here and listen to you sing all day, Simon.
Anyway, this is just I'm just going to give you one last image, which is the text for one of the baritone arias. So you see how each character is haunted in a little bit differently. But let's stop here. I'm going to stop sharing perhaps, and then we can how do I stop sharing? There we go.
Oh,
And we can
great.
just go to the next part.
Okay. Well, we do have a question from Margaret. Margaret asks, at the beginning of the lecture, you discussed the idea of the performative as a way in which we think about categories of being. And she, and I'm sure all of us, would like to know more. Can you elaborate on these categories further? There's a thread around categories of citizenship, class, race, and sexuality. The question is whether you could further articulate some of these categories of being that you have in mind.
Okay. Yeah, so sure. First of all, I just want to mark the fact that nowadays when we say performative, it has such a negative connotation, as virtual signaling, performative alliance and that type of thing. And I think it's important to think about that as well. But I would say that my own thinking about performative, at least when I started using the term in a pedagogical context, was to very much think about it along the lines of how queer theory, in particular Judith Butler, in her interests in Austen, think about the speech act. In that the performative is something that is enacted through the form. And therefore, if you were to think about a speech act, would be something like, I promise you, that by saying something, you actually are doing that thing. And therefore, the performativity of gender was something that we very much associate with the Butlerian way of thinking about the construction of gender. So that's one way of thinking about it. But maybe another way that we can think about it is how, for example, in Squatting Project, Guangzhou, I was, in a sense, using language and using the various interstitial relationship between power within language to, in a sense, enact the performative that is not ever based on identity or anything that is solid, but a relation of being.
Thank you. So we have one more question. Gustavo is asking, please discuss how your strategies and your use of institutional critique or social practice has changed. I'm not sure exactly what this means. Changed over the years, your view of conceptual art. I'm not. Okay, I'll let it stand. I think you understand it better than
I think
Yeah.
that is a great question.
Go ahead. And then there's another part, but let's answer that part first.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Okay, so it has changed throughout the years in the sense that for somebody who was educated as I was, and I was sort of like associated with, you know, the Whitney program and the type of art world that I entered into as a exhibiting artist or as a thinker, talker, whatever, in the late 80s, early 90s, was very much a moment of identity politics, but it was also a moment of institutional critique in the sense that we as people of color, as marked bodies, as racialized bodies, were often called upon to perform a task in relationship to the institution. And that task was to, in a sense, perform your identity. You know, and that's how I began to think about misrecognition as a very important way that I had to, you know, use in order to, on the one hand, take part in the discussion, and on the other hand, critique the discussion. You know, so I think that people of color, artists of color in particular, were always, in a sense, used as an implicit instrument of institutional critique as it was demanded by institutions from the 1980s until now. Okay, so that's the context of how one socially fits into that mode. But then I would say at the same time that I began to think a lot about the aesthetics of institutional critique, which consisted a lot of documatter and in various ways, quotations of homages to, I don't know, Michael Asher, Andre Fraser, etc., that I didn't really think furthered the discussion or furthered my own interests. And therefore, Squatting Project Veen was, in a sense, a way to perform a sort of meta commentary on institutional critique while implicating myself into it. It became somewhat more difficult as we all move into the 21st century. And that's when I began to think about something that I didn't get a chance to talk about, you know, in the lecture because I ran out of time. But you can actually just Google my name and the Hammer Museum, you know, and you would see a video of it. This project called Actions, which I initiated in the year 2000 when Yvonne Rainer and I went to support the strikers at MoMA. And I suddenly saw completely, almost completely formed within me, at least in terms of the idea of an art workers theater piece. And so I began to think about theater, you know, as a type of possibility, even though I wasn't really interested in theater, but I was interested in the idea of theater as a metaphor for war. And I was also interested in workers' theater. And I was also very interested in making work for the subject. By that, I mean, I was an art worker. I was a young person who went to New York, very young person. First time I went to New York, it was 1985, 84, 85, and, with the exception of this last year, I really hadn't really left New York. There's not a single year in my life that I'm not in New York, living in New York or working in New York, or, still live in New York, um, and I was very much taken by how the people who were on strike at MoMA in the year 2000, I am a part of this larger institution that is the art world. And so, so it's an excellent question, because it has changed in the sense that I very much took it up. I took it upon as a given that institutions are made up of the people in it, while at the same time I acknowledge the absolutely brutal neoliberal capitalistic, and in Nitzan Shiket's word, fascist dimensions of many institutions, including the ones we have to work through.
Second part of the question, if you want to address it, and then I think we'll close because we're coming up on 3:20, is could you also speak a little bit about your view of the evolution of technology and medium? And then Gustavo asks 4 points around your theoretical framing of architecture and environment, the viewer's experience in their own mind, performance in terms of the labor of action, and then the universal imaginary. Is that something that you deal in?
Well, I don't think I can think about the universal imaginary without thinking about all of these other things. And I think that the way that I work is that architecture is not about edifice, architecture. And one of the things that I really think about through, especially through Duchamp, I have a whole other body of work that thinks through Marcel Duchamp and Étant donné. And that is, I think about what Duchamp refers to as the inframance, or the infra-thin, which, something he describes as something like the warmth of the seat after somebody has sat on it. So that infra-thinness. I think about that infra-thinness, and this is how perhaps I think about Duchamp a little bit differently from how other people think about Duchamp. I think about that infra-thinness as infrastructure. So in other words, affect is structure. Affect, it's kind of like, what is architecture, right? So Mark Wigley, for example, would make an argument that it is surfaces, it is walls, it is drapery. So I'm not making exactly that argument, but I'm saying that the way that I think, in a sort of, Derridian sense, is that intertextuality saturates all modes of being and operations, so that things are intertextually combined and thought through, like how your brain will re-territorialize one section if it is injured in order to use it to do something else, right? So there's a level at which I think about subjectivity, not only as pertaining to the subject, of individuality, but I was talking to one of the students earlier today, and one of the ideas I'm very interested in thinking about is how do we take responsibility for our intimacies? So in other words, if intimacy is that thing that you really feel, and if artists can be thought of as people who either reproduce that intimacy or not reproduce that intimacy, but use it as a type of haunting, how do we take responsibility for it? Much like how do we maybe can take responsibility for the unconscious. So these are kind of ways of thinking about matter, material, the ethical, and the aesthetic together.
Thank you so much. It's just been tremendous to listen to you. And every time that I have the pleasure of encountering you, it expands my own thought and practice immeasurably. I'm sure I speak for everyone here.
Thank you so much.
We adore you, Simon. Thank you for being with us. We're going to wrap this meeting now. So thanks everyone for joining us. And seminar students, let's take 10. We'll reconvene at the Visiting Artist Seminar link at 3:30. Thanks again, everyone. This has been a wonderful semester. We hope it's our last one online and that we'll see you all in the flesh next semester.